Welcome to Canadian Coffee House Crime. My name is Catharine. In lieu of the first anniversary of this channel, I thought I would cover something a little more involved. The Bernardo and Karla Homolka case. The most famous and disturbing case in Canada, to me anyways. I read the book a while ago and it bothers me still to this day. Let's see how I do this one. Welcome to St. Catharines, Ontario. St. Catharines has a population of around 150,000 people, nestled in what is called Canada's Niagara region, which sits on the Niagara River. It is the most populated city in the Niagara. I made another video called The Hauntings of Fort George, Niagara on the lake from that area. I like the way that one turned out. Check it out. The first people to inhabit the area were the Iroquois and were last reported in the area in 1671 and was settled by the British in the 1780s. Around this time, an American family called the Merritts called the area their home. The family members worked their political and financial magic to produce what is the Whelan Canal. The canal is 27 miles long and sees about 3,000 ships every year. It was built from 1824 to 1833 to keep ships from descending into the unnavigable Niagara Falls, only 20 kilometers away. The Niagara Falls escarpment are a combination of three waterfalls: the Horseshoe Falls, the American Falls, and the Bridal Veil Falls. It has a virtual decline of 160 feet and drops 165 million liters of water every single minute, making it the most powerful waterfall in North America. The first recorded honeymoon there was in 1801. There have been many barrel drops and tightrope walkers. Tourism became the area's main form of industry. The oldest tourist attraction is a boat cruise called the Maid of the Mist. It has been taking passengers to the base of the waterfalls since 1846. A couple of my favorite movies were shot there: Superman 2, and Pirates of the Caribbean at World's End. This area was also the stopping area for the Underground Railroad and home of Harriet Tubman. The Underground Railroad was route of secret passages and safe houses that African American refugees used to flee slavery from America. Harriet Tubman was also a refugee who fled from America and called St. Catharines her home. She went on 13 missions back and forth on the Underground Railway to help free 70 slaves into Canada during the 1850s. At this time, St. Catharines had a population of 6,000 people, 800 of whom were African descent. St. Catharines is proud of their General Motors plant that opened in 1954, which mass produces engines and transmissions that are shipped out to other GM plants in North America for assembly. St. Catharines has the nickname of Garden City, as it has 1,000 acres of gardens, parks, and trails. On February 17, 1993, police arrived at the home of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka at 57 Bayview to arrest Paul after a DNA sample he had given to the police 2 years earlier matched to a sample taken in a sexual assault investigation. The police had a search warrant for their St. Catharines home. The extent of the search warrant was limited, but the search lasted 71 days and the police found nothing. While in custody, although, Paul informed his lawyer that there were videotapes hidden in the ceiling light fixture in the upstairs bathroom. His lawyer found the tapes and hid them from investigators, but when his lawyer resigned, his new lawyer turned them over to the police and all hell broke loose. Paul Bernardo was born in Scarborough, Ontario in August 27th, 1964 to Kenneth Walter Bernardo and Marilyn Elizabeth Bernardo, an upper middle class family. Marilyn had been adopted by a lawyer, Gerald Eastman, and his wife Elizabeth. Kenneth Bernardo was the son of an Italian immigrant and a woman of English heritage. Kenneth's father made a very successful life in the marble and tile business. Kenneth did not go into the family business but became an accountant instead. Kenneth and Marilyn married in 1960 and settled in a nice middle-class neighborhood in the Scarborough area of Toronto. Paul presented himself as being a happy and well-adjusted child and was an active member of the Boy Scouts and a summer camp counselor. The kids loved him, and he seemed to enjoy being with them. He was athletic, he was a lifeguard, and took karate lessons. He was a young boy who smiled a lot. He was apparently so cute, with his dimpled good looks and sweet smile, that many of the mothers just wanted to pinch him on the cheeks whenever they saw him. He was the perfect child they all wanted, polite, well-mannered, doing well in school. The teenage girls also adored him. He had angelic looks and a shy, pleasing demeanor. Those who dated him in high school considered him a thoughtful and considerate lover. Paul attended Sir Wilfrid Laurier College Institute, and in 1982, when he was 18 years old, the University of Toronto Scarborough, he took business management. Another notorious Canadian murderer, Russell Williams, was coincidentally 2 years behind him. I did a case on Russell Williams. It is actually my most popular case. Please check it out. Bernardo and his college friends practiced pickup techniques on young women. They met in bars and were fairly successful. He thought he was good looking, he could get any girl he wanted, and had a lot of ego. Paul was out to make something of himself. He was intelligent, worked hard in school, and held a series of responsible after-school jobs. He had a good head for figures and the makings of a good future businessman. Paul and his friends were recruited into the Amway business. It was noted how deeply Paul was influenced by the things he had learned from a few of the people who recruited him. Paul used Amway techniques in many facets of his life, not only in sales and business, but also in personal relationships. He brought the books and tapes of famous motivational get-rich and famous experts. Although Paul didn't make much money from Amway, he embraced the philosophy from it. In October 1887, Paul, at 23 years old, was working as a junior accountant. Karla Homolka was in Scarborough attending a pet store conference when she was approached by Paul at a Howard Johnson Hotel restaurant while she was getting coffee. She was 17 years old. It was lust at first sight. Karla Leanne Homolka was born May 4th, 1970 to Dorothy and Karel Homolka. Her dad sold lamps at a flea market. Her mom was an administrative assistant at a hospital. Karla was oldest of 3 girls. Her sisters were Lori and Tammy. They had a pool in the backyard and had lots of gatherings, and Karla was popular and always had a date. Karla spent her childhood playing with Barbie dolls. She was smart, but wasn't an over-the-top academic student in school. When she got older, she got into Ouija boards, the occult, and seemed fascinated with death. At one point, her friend's pet had died, and Karla dug it up to see it. She was volunteering at the Martindale Animal Clinic as a vet assistant. She was part of a high school club that supported the idealism, a big diamond ring from a wealthy older man, and Paul Bernardo seemed to fit that notion, as she had a Disney princess set of mind. She called him her prince and was captivated by him. He was a strong person, and she liked the control he had over her, and would do absolutely anything to keep his love. He was 5 years older, tall, blonde, and handsome. Their blonde appearances made them seem like a clean-cut Ken and Barbie couple. On December 23rd, 1990, tragedy struck the Homolka family when the youngest daughter, Tammy, died of choking on her own vomit in her sleep. Tammy Lynn Homolka was born January 1st, 1975, and was only 15 years old, just a few days shy of her 16th birthday when she passed away in her own home. The ambulance had been called by Karla late that night. Tammy's parents and her sister Lori were sleeping at the time. Her death was ruled as a choking incident as a result of alcohol poisoning. Tammy grew up in the neighborhood of Port Credit. She was athletic. She participated in track and field, cross-country running, but soccer was her favorite. She was a grade 10 student at Sir Winston Churchill Secondary School in St. Catharines. She was buried in the Victoria Lawn Cemetery with an invitation in the coffin to Karla and Paul's wedding that was to be held 6 months later. June 29th, 1991, Paul and Karla had their huge, lavish fairy tale wedding. Karla had a puffy $2,000 ball gown wedding dress. Their wedding was perfect. They had the historic church in Niagara-on-the-Lake with the white horses in the carriage, champagne, a sit-down dinner for 150 guests with Fields stuffed pheasant at Queen's Landing. No expense was spared. Paul had carefully controlled every detail of the wedding, although, from Karla's wedding dress to her hairstyle, to the menu, and to the inclusion of love, honor, and obey in Karla's wedding vow, and he would not allow the minister to pronounce them husband and wife. It had to be man and wife. After which they went to Hawaii for their honeymoon. They moved into a beautiful home on 57 Bayview in St. Catharines. Now, I like to say they lived happily ever after, like the Disney couple that they were, but I wouldn't be writing this if that were true. Now, as we go back to the beginning of this story, things are going to get dark. In 1981, when Paul Bernardo was 16 years old, he was informed by his mother that Kenneth was not his biological father, showing Paul a picture of her boyfriend. Repulsed, Paul began to call his mother slut, slob, and whore, and she came back at him, calling him a bastard from hell. Marilyn became depressed and grotesquely obese. She stopped taking care of the home and the children. Marilyn contracted agoraphobia and withdrew into her own world in the basement of the house. Paul's father, Kenneth, who was open-minded about the wife's affair which produced Paul, still had his own problems. Kenneth had fondled a young girl and went to court for it. He started hanging around the neighborhood at night, peeping into windows of young women. He had also started to sexually abuse his young daughter, Paul's older sister Deborah, in front of other family members. Beneath Paul's charming facade, he gradually developed dark sexual fantasies. Paul started peeping into windows. Paul delighted in humiliating his dates in public and engaging in aggressive intercourse in bed. Paul's first girlfriend tired of his domineering and left him for one of his friends. In retaliation, Paul set fire to all of her belongings to which he had access to. His relationships became increasingly violent and unstable, and his partners were threatened with death if they ever disclosed the abuse. Bernardo would beat his girlfriends. In 1986, Paul was served with restraining orders by 2 women after he made obscene phone calls. Paul read American Psycho like it was his Bible. Then in 1987, Scarborough came under attack by a series of sexual assaults by Paul Bernardo. On May 4th, 1987, he sexually assaulted a 21-year-old woman in front of her parents' house. On May 14th, 1987, there was a sexual assault on a 19-year-old woman in the backyard of her parents' house. On July 17th, 1987, there was an attempted sexual assault of a young woman, but she fought back. On September 29th, 1987, there was an attempted sexual assault of a 15-year-old girl in her own bedroom after her home was broken into, but Paul fled when the mother came into the room. Then, 1 month after that attack, in October 1987, Paul, 23 years old, met 17-year-old Karla Homolka at the hotel during her pet store conference. The two had shared an immediate attraction, having sex that night, and Karla encouraged Paul's sadistic sexual behavior, and they discovered that they had the same sadistic sexual interests and desires. She would write letters saying that you can do whatever you want to me. They quickly began a sadomasochistic relationship in which Bernardo acted as an abusive master and Homolka as a willing slave. The whole while they dated, Paul Bernardo was also brutally raping girls in Scarborough with Homolka's knowledge and approval. Paul had asked her what she would think if he was a rapist. She said she thought it would be cool. Their love deepened. He started raping women on a continuous basis. Karla knew exactly what Paul was doing and encouraged him. One victim even remembered seeing a woman with the rapist with what appeared to be a video camera in her hand. 2 months after Paul and Karla met on December 16, 1987 in Scarborough, there was a sexual assault on a 15-year-old girl. 7 days later, on December 23, 1987, there was a sexual assault of a 17-year-old girl with a knife he used to threaten his victims. At this point, Paul began to be known as a Scarborough rapist. 4 months later, April 18, 1988, there was an attack of a 17-year-old girl. 6 weeks later, on May 30, 1888, another sexual assault of an 18-year-old woman in Mississauga, Ontario. 4 months later, on October 4th, 1988, an attempted rape in Scarborough. Then, on November 16th, 1988, a sexual assault of an 18-year-old woman in the backyard of her parents' home. Then, 8 months later, on August 15th, 1989, another sexual assault of a 22-year-old woman. 3 months later, on November 21st, 1989, a sexual assault of a 15-year-old girl. A month later, on December 22nd, 1989, a sexual assault of a 19-year-old woman. 5 months later, on May 26, 1990, a sexual assault of a 19-year-old woman. This time, although the woman remembered what her attacker looked like, and a composite portrait was released 2 days later by police and publicized in Toronto and surrounding areas. There's evidence tying Paul to the presumed murder of 22-year-old Elizabeth Bain, who disappeared on June 19, 1990. Her body was never found. From May to September 1990, police submitted more than 130 suspects' samples for DNA testing. Investigators received 2 tips pointing to Bernardo. The first in June had been filed by a bank employee. The second was from a woman Bernardo had talked about his sex life to her and said that he liked rough sex and had been called in on previous rape investigation in December 1987, but he had never been interviewed. Police interviewed Paul on November 20th, 1990 for 35 minutes. Paul voluntarily provided DNA samples for forensic testing. Paul admitted that he resembled the composite sketch that had been taken. In 1990, Paul proposed to Karla. Paul was hanging around Karla's family home a lot. They liked him and didn't know about his criminal side, such as smuggling cigarettes across the border that he started with a buddy while in college. He also took notice that Karla had 2 younger sisters. One of them was 15 years old, Tammy Lynn. He told Karla about his sexual interest in Tammy. He would peer into her window and enter her room to masturbate while she slept. Karla helped Bernardo by breaking the windows in her sister's room, allowing him access. Paul was persistent that he wanted to take Tammy's virginity without Tammy's knowledge or consent. Karla became responsible for making this possible for Paul. plus agreeing to the videotape of it. Tammy was to be Paul's Christmas present from Karla. Karla worked at a veterinarian clinic, so she had knowledge of sedatives used for animals. She decided on using halothane, an anesthetic which animals inhale before surgery. She stole this anesthetic from the clinic she worked at. On December 23, 1990, Paul gave sleeping pills to 15-year-old Tammy in a rum and eggnog cocktail. The effects of the drugs and alcohol were swift, and Tammy was out cold on the couch in no time. When the other members of the household went up to bed, Karla and Paul started to work on Tammy, undressing her. Paul held the camera on Tammy while he sexually assaulted her, leaving Karla to keep the halothane-laden rag over her sister's face. Then he ordered Karla to make sexual advances to her sleeping sister. Suddenly, Tammy threw up. Karla held her sister upside down to try and clear her throat. Tammy choked to death. They attempted to revive her, but it failed, so they dressed her, hid their drugs and camera, and called the ambulance. The first time that Tammy and Karla's parents knew of this tragedy was when they heard the ambulance pull it up to the house. Tammy was pronounced dead at St. Catherine's General Hospital without regaining consciousness. Everyone was led to believe that Tammy had died from accidental choking on her vomit. Despite being observed vacuuming and washing laundry in the middle of the night, and despite a chemical burn on Tammy's face, the regional municipality of Niagara coroner and Karla's family accepted the couple's versions of the events. After Tammy's death, Paul and Karla videotaped themselves engaging in sexual intercourse in Tammy's room, on Tammy's bed, with Karla wearing Tammy's clothing and pretending to be Tammy. At one point, it was implied that Tammy's death was not an accident and that Karla had deliberately administered an overdose of halothane because she was so upset by her fiancé's attraction to her sister that she took steps to remove Tammy from his affections permanently. After this, they moved into the home of 57 Bayview. January 12, 1991, only 3 weeks after Tammy's death, Bernardo abducted a girl, took her to the house, sexually assaulted her while Karla watched, and dropped her off on a deserted road near Lake Gibson. At about 5:30 a.m. on April 6, 1991, Bernardo abducted a 14-year-old. Karla distracted her by waving at her from a car. Then Paul dragged her into the shrubbery and sexually assaulted her. On June 7, 1991, Karla managed to befriend a teenager who worked at the vet clinic. Jane, her name, idolized Karla as a beautiful, sophisticated role model. Karla invited Jane over one night. Karla took Jane to dinner and spent hours talking to her and gave her sweet alcoholic drinks that were laced with halcyon tablets. Jane passed out and slept deeply. Paul came home and was delighted when he saw how much Jane resembled Tammy. He was a bit concerned that Karla was using the same drug that killed Tammy to subdue Jane, but Karla convinced him that she was in control of the situation this time. They undressed Jane. Paul videotaped Karla while she fondled the sleeping girl. Then Paul took her virginity. After that, he brutally sodomized her. Jane was so drugged that she did not wake up. Karla was left to clean the blood off the 15-year-old girl and put her to bed for the night. The next morning, Jane was very sick to her stomach and sore. She met Paul thinking she had never met him before, not knowing what had happened to her. Leslie Erin Mahaffey was born on July 5, 1976. Her father was an oceanographer for the Canadian Federal Fisheries and Oceans Department, and sometimes he would be on assignments away from home for weeks at a time. Her mother was a teacher. Leslie Mahaffey was a grade 9 student at M.M. Robinson High School in Burlington. Like many teens that age, she wore braces on her teeth. A few weeks before her 15th birthday, on the evening of June 14, 1991, Mahaffey went to a funeral home to attend a wake for her friend Chris Evans, a boy who had died in a car accident earlier that week. A large group of teens met in the woods to drink and console one another. As the evening wound down, a couple of friends walked her home shortly before 2 a.m., where they stayed with her while she found the side door locked. She told them the front door would surely be unlocked and sent them home. After they left her, she found the front door was locked as well. She found herself locked out of her house. Leslie walked to a payphone at Mac's Milk and called a friend's house for permission to sleep over. Her friend told her no because the girlfriend didn't think that her mother would allow it at that hour, and after a lengthy conversation that ended after 2:30 a.m., Leslie said she would go back home, wake up her own mother Debbie, to get into the house. Leslie went back to her home to see if there was any way she could get in without waking her parents. With the worst possible luck imaginable, she encountered Paul Bernardo, who was prowling around. Paul was supplementing his income by smuggling cigarettes across the border and needed the stolen license plates to disguise his frequent visits across the American-Canadian line, so he was in the neighborhood looking for license plates to steal. Paul then offered her a cigarette, which he said was back at his car. Once he got Leslie to the car to fetch the cigarette, he pulled a knife on the girl. He wrapped his sweatshirt quickly around her head, forced her into the vehicle. Later that day, Leslie's friend telephoned the Mahaffey house to inquire about Leslie's well-being and explained the call that Leslie had made after discovering that she had been locked out, prompting Leslie's mother to start searching for Leslie. Finding no trace of her daughter, she eventually became concerned and contacted the police. After Paul took Leslie home at 3 a.m, he began to videotape the 14-year-old Leslie naked and blindfolded. When Karla woke up, Paul gave Karla elaborate instructions on film how to make love to Leslie, who was sedated with Karla's veterinary drugs. After 24 hours of sexual assault and abuse by both the killers, Mahaffey was murdered sometime on June 15, 1991. Bernardo had strangled Mahaffey with an electrical cord. On June 16, 1991, Bernardo and Homolka moved Mahaffey's body from upstairs bedroom to the basement. During this time, Bernardo and Homolka hosted Homolka's family for a Father's Day dinner on the main floor of the house, with Karla making a special effort to keep her mother from going downstairs. When the family left, Paul and Karla put together their tent in the basement. They put Leslie inside of the tent and then used Paul's grandfather's circular saw to dismember Leslie's body into pieces small enough to lift when covered with concrete. When Leslie failed to phone home on her own birthday, about 2 weeks later, her family was certain that she had not called because she could not. On the evening of June 29, 1991, the day of Karla's and Paul's wedding, a man and his wife were canoeing on Lake Gibson when they came across a concrete block and, with the help of a fisherman, pulled out the concrete block and looked at it closely. Inside the block was the calf and foot of a young woman. A few minutes later, the area was alive with cops who found a total of 5 concrete blocks that had been dumped there in the shallow water. Not long afterwards, the torso of the young woman was found in the water. The concrete block containing the torso weighed over 200 pounds. The body parts that had been found in the concrete block had been cut from her torso with a power saw. Her braces and dental records confirmed her identity. Leslie's remains were placed under a family headstone at Burlington Memorial Gardens in Burlington, Ontario, Canada. There is also a heart-shaped garden with a plaque in Leslie's honor at M.M. Robinson High School and a memorial bench close to her family's headstone. After Paul's and Karla's wedding, they had their honeymoon in Hawaii. A newspaper clipping found during the police search of Bernardo's house described a sexual assault that occurred in Hawaii during the couple's honeymoon there in the summer of 1991. Law enforcement officials both in Canada and the U.S. have stated that their belief that Paul was responsible for this sexual assault. In August 1991, Jane was invited back to the couple's residence and was again drugged. The girl was vomiting and stopped breathing while being sexually assaulted. Paul and Karla were able to resuscitate her, although. On November 30th, 1991, Terry Anderson, a grade 9 student at Lakeport Secondary School, vanished. Anderson's body was found in the water at Port Dalhousie. Kristen Dawn French was born May 10th, 1976 to parents Donna and Doug French. She was a member of a precision ice skating team, which won several medals, and a member of the girls' rowing team at Holy Cross Catholic Secondary School in St. Catharines. On April 16th, 1992, she was walking home from the Holy Cross Secondary School, a Catholic school in St. Catharines. French was approached at the entrance of the Grace Lutheran Church parking lot by Karla and Paul, saying they needed directions. While Kristen was assisting Karla with directions, Kristen stood by the car looking at Karla's map. Paul attacked her from behind and forced her into the car at knife point. While Kristen was seated in the front seat, Karla held down Kristen by her hair. Later, Kristen's shoe was recovered from the parking lot. The kidnapping was seen by several eyewitnesses. When Kristen went missing, it drew immediate attention to her family and friends, and she always followed the routine of a 15-minute walk from school to her home to feed and walk her dog in time. Kristen is remembered by saying on camera, "Some things are worth dying for." And at one point she said to Paul, "I don't know how your wife can stand being around you." Paul murdered Kristen before going to Paul's parents for Easter dinner. Paul had strangled Kristen for 7 minutes while Karla watched. Kristen was strangled with a noose around her neck, which was secured to a hope chest. Kristen's new body was discovered on April 30th, 1992, in a ditch in Burlington, about 45 minutes from St. Catharines. They left her body battered and her hair partially shaven in a ditch along a rural road. Karla said they took her hair to keep her from being identified, but a lot of people speculate her hair was a trophy. The medical examiner's report state Kristen was held in captivity for 3 days, during which Paul and Karla videotaped themselves torturing and subjecting the 15-year-old to sexual humiliation and degradation while forcing her to drink large amounts of alcohol. They murdered her on April 19th, 1992. In December 1992, the Center of Forensic Sciences finally began testing DNA samples provided by Paul 2 years earlier, 26 months earlier. Toronto police were informed that it matched that of the Scarborough rapist and immediately placed him under 24-hour surveillance. That same month, on December 27th, 1992, Paul severely beat Karla with a flashlight, leaving multiple bruises. Karla's parents took her to St. Catharines General Hospital, where she gave a statement that she was a battered spouse and she filed charges against Paul. Karla was placed in the home of her aunt and uncle, who was a Toronto cop, in January 1993. Karla was interviewed on February 9th, 1993, but only focused on Paul's abuse to her. Later that night, Karla told her aunt and uncle that Paul was a Scarborough rapist, that she and Paul were involved in the sexual assaults and murders of Leslie Mojave and Christian French, and was all recorded on videotape. The investigation of Tammy Homolka's death was reopened, and her body was exhumed. The invitation and picture that was in her coffin to Paul's and Karla's wedding was thrown out. 2 days later, Karla met with her lawyer, who sought legal immunity from the Crown prosecutor in exchange for her cooperation. Karla pleaded guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter in exchange for a sentence of 12 years in prison. She was released from prison in 2005 at age 35. She married the brother of her lawyer, Terry Bordelis, when she was released, and has 3 children and lives in Quebec with a changed name. On February 17, 1992, detectives arrested Paul, and he was charged with 2 counts each of kidnapping, unlawful confinement, aggravated sexual assault, and first-degree murder and dismemberment. He made a statement that he had sexually assaulted as many as 30 women. In May of 1995, Paul Bernardo's trial began. Paul was sentenced to life in prison without parole for at least 25 years. He was designated a dangerous offender, making him unlikely to ever be released. Thank you very much for watching. My name is Catharine, and this is Canadian Coffeehouse Crime. Please feel free to press the like button, as it helps with my exposure, and subscribe to my channel. I try to put out a new video every week. See you in the next case.